A couple weeks ago I was contacted by Kingroon. They have released a new desktop size Resin 3D printer with a mono 2K LCD screen. It has a pretty nice build size capacity of 8 by 13 by 18, so it can go pretty high, wide and also deep, and therefore is pretty much perfect for the scale modeler in use on printing scale modeling parts. So if you've seen any of these 3D printer reviews before, you probably know how these printers arrive. They come in a nice box, are mostly assembled, and require a little bit of unpacking and installation. The first step you need to do is, of course, remove all of the styrofoam on the inside and then start leveling the print bed. Now this is similar in pretty much all of these resin printers, so I'm not going to go into detail on that. If you want to know more specifically about that, I will leave links in the description down below to the Kingroon website, and they will have all that information over there. Once the installation of the printer has been completed and the leveling has been done, you can of course move on to printing your first files. Now for this you will need a slicer, and in this case these Kingroon machines are done on the software from Chitubox. So on the USB stick that is supplied with the printer, you already get the software on there, so you can simply just download it and install it off of the USB stick, or go to the website from Chitubox and download it through them. Now one of the strange things that I encountered during the installation of Chitubox, I of course already had it on my computer from various of the other printers that I've tested in the past, and somehow the newest version of Chitubox is not compatible with the Kingroon KP6. So luckily on the USB stick, like I said, there is a version installed that is 1.8, and that actually works with the printer, but it is not the most recent software and therefore doesn't really work as well as you probably want it to. I have mentioned this to Kingroon and hopefully they will sort that out soon, but for now you just resort to the USB stick version of the Chitubox, and that is the older one. Now in the meantime I was removing the parts from the build plate, and that is done with a metal scraper. There are also some plastic scrapers included, but those are simply too weak for popping these parts off and actually are pretty much only meant to clean out the actual vat where the resin rests in and not the build plate itself, so just use the metal scraper instead. It will leave some deep scratches and mars on the actual build plate, but that is no problem whatsoever. The resin will just fill it in and even help the prints stick to the build plate better than the smoother build plates that you start out with. The files have now completed printing, been removed from the print bed, and need some cleaning up, as there is still some excess resin on the parts, and that needs to be removed prior to the actual curing stage and leaving the finished parts behind. So with that said, I'm using some 99% alcohol, isopropyl alcohol, just pouring it into the Elegoo cleaning machine that I have here. You can also just clean it with a brush and a small jar with this stuff and do it by hand, but since I have these machines on hand, I figured I'd use them. So you simply just pop it all in, set the timer, and it will start cleaning and swirling all of the alcohol over the parts and removing the excess resin. And about 5 minutes later, the resin parts are now fully cleaned. The alcohol is a bit red of a tint, but that is due to all of the excess resin being left in there, of course, and mixing up with the alcohol that is in there. No problem, however, the alcohol is still fully functional and cleans the parts really well. You simply then just take the parts out of the alcohol vat and set them aside to dry. The parts need to be completely dry, so no more wet or shiny spots need to be on them before you actually start the curing process. And you can just set them aside to let the alcohol evaporate, even put them outside in a nice breeze, or use any other way of evaporating the alcohol, but simply just leaving them there for a couple of minutes or an hour or so will completely dry them out as well. Now since this is a UV curing resin, you will need a UV light source to cure the parts. In this case I have the Elegoo system, as I mentioned earlier, and this comes with a light curing box too that emits UV light onto the parts, turns them around, has light from various angles, and cures them properly. Now if you don't have these parts or pieces, that is no problem. You can just leave them outside and they will cure through natural sunlight. So I'm just placing all of the parts onto the rotating platform, then put the UV cover on top, set the timer, and start curing them. Now, one thing I do want to mention, these parts are printed with supports, and supports in the scale modeling section are better known as sprues, and these will need to be removed. Now, prior to the actual final cure, the parts are still a little bit flexible and therefore don't tend to break as easily, and it is a lot easier to remove all of the sprues or supports from the parts before curing. Now, some people actually want to do this after. That is also totally fine and up to you. I simply prefer doing it before. That just makes it a lot less likely for the parts to be damaged during the removal of these sprues. So just like the cleaning process, it is about a 5-minute cure time for these parts. If the parts are a lot bigger and maybe have even more complicated shapes and forms to them, you can leave it in longer, or like I said, just leave it outside and let the sun do the work. The parts now have been cleaned and cured, so I no longer need the curing chamber or the cleaning vat. So for anybody curious about the specific parts and files that I used, these are from BlackboxSTL. He has a super cool Instagram page where he shares all of his builds and also the projects that he is doing in creating these files and his tests as well. His files are available on Cults 3D, and I will be leaving links in the description of the video down below. I highly recommend using his files as they are super high quality and come out really, really nicely. During the testing of this machine, I did run into a couple of problems. First of all, the prints did not really want to stick to the print bed itself, and that was simply fixed by changing a couple of settings and also sanding down the build plate with a 180 grit sandpaper just to give it a bit more bite for the first initial layers to stick to it. So during testing, I tested various different settings on the machine itself, and finally came to the conclusion that a couple of settings worked really well. The first couple of test files that I printed were from some seats, and I printed them 0.02 layer height. Now, as you can see, with it set at a 0.2 layer height, the layers are still pretty visible. Now, with this also being an older version of Chitubox, like I mentioned earlier, the newest version didn't work with his printer somehow. I have told them about this, so hopefully they will be fixing it. But the older version did work perfectly fine on the machine itself. However, it is not as sophisticated as the newest software, and therefore the prints do not come out as good as they probably should. For those wondering, yes, I did use anti-aliasing, but in the older version of Chitubox, it didn't really work as well as it does in the newer. Now, with the second print also showing here on screen on the right, that is printed at 0.01. The layer lines are a lot less pronounced. There is still a bit of a problem with the anti-aliasing, as I mentioned before, but that is simply down to the Chitubox software. Otherwise, the print came out a lot better. Yes, it did take a lot longer to print, as there are twice as many layer lines, so it takes twice as long to print, but in the end, I think it is well worth it. It does wear out the printer a little bit faster, as the screen has to be working a lot more often with twice the amount of layer lines, of course, and therefore just giving a better result, but it is a bit of a contrast between using it for the actual finished parts or just wanting to get the longest amount of life out of the printer or screen. So that is all up to you. Now, of course, I didn't just test it on the first two seats, I tested it on multiple. So we have done a couple of sets of other seats as well with similar results, and I also tried to scale it down a little bit more into some smaller parts like steering wheels. Just like with the seats, I also printed these at 0.01 and 0.02, with 0.01 giving the better result as it has less layer lines, and specifically on these smaller parts with more detailed pieces in them to show for, it is a lot better to print it at a higher resolution with a lower size of layer line. So 0.01 is my recommended setting, but again, it does have its pros and cons, of course. Overall, all of these steering wheels turned out really nice. The details are captured in there super well, and I'm really excited about this one. And to finalize my verdict about this printer, it is on the lower end of quality as it comes to printers these days with all of these resin printers out here. but it is also one of the cheaper machines. So I would probably recommend this machine very highly, as it is a lot cheaper than all of the other machines I have tested. The files and prints do come out really well. It's not as good as I've seen on other printers, but then again, for half the price, there is something to say for that as well. And specifically, if you want to start out in resin 3D printing, I think it is a good idea to start with a cheaper machine, as you will probably be making a lot of mistakes and therefore could potentially fairly easily ruin the machine or damage it in some form or way, and it is cheaper to replace this one than it is, of course, to replace one of the more expensive machines. Now, as always, I will be leaving links down in the description below to Kingroon, where you can purchase the machine, the resin that I used, and of course all of the parts and files that I use from BlackboxSTL.